There is a moment in the middle of a very long flight, somewhere over the dark Atlantic, the stars out, the engines doing their steady, patient work, when a passenger would push back from their seat, smooth their jacket, and walk toward a door in the floor. Not a lavatory, not a galley, a door in the floor, and behind it a staircase, a spiral staircase. They would descend it carefully, one hand on the rail, the carpet thick under their feet, and emerge into a room. A proper room, low lit, mirrored, 14 seats arranged for conversation. A bar along one wall, the sound of ice finding a glass. Someone already there, laughing quietly at something, 30,000 feet above the ocean. A staircase, a room underground. This is the story of the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, the most luxurious airliner ever built, the financial catastrophe that nearly broke the airlines that flew it, and the 12 remarkable years when crossing an ocean meant something entirely different from what it means today. It means descending that staircase and ordering a drink. The year is 1949. The war has been over for 4 years, and the world is still sorting itself out. The Iron Curtain has just fallen across Europe. Television is brand new. A family car costs roughly $1,500. A one-way first-class ticket from New York to London on Pan American World Airways costs $630, the equivalent of 5 or 6 months of an average worker's wages. For that, you get something no one had ever offered at 30,000 feet before. Pan American had been in the business of glamour since the flying boat days. Their pre-war Boeing 314 Clippers had carried passengers across the Pacific in staterooms, with silver service and proper meals. Juan Tripper, Pan Am's founder and president, was not a man who thought small. When he came to Boeing in the mid-1940s, looking for a new long-range airliner, he made his requirements plain. He wanted something that could compete with an ocean liner, not merely transport people across the Atlantic, but give them a reason to prefer flying. Boeing had something to offer. Born from the bones of the B-29 Superfortress, the bomber that had ended the Pacific War, their new Model 377 carried the military's engineering inside the most civilized skin anyone had yet put on a commercial aircraft. The design was clever in a particular way, a double-bubble fuselage shaped in cross-section like a figure 8, with the larger lobe on top for passengers and a smaller lobe below. One level for living, one level for something else entirely. The question was what to put in that lower lobe. Tripp knew the answer immediately: a lounge, a bar, a place to go. On November 29, 1945, Pan Am signed a $24.5 million order for 20 Stratocruisers, at that moment the largest commercial aircraft order in the history of aviation. Boeing, without a single airline customer yet confirmed, had already ordered 50 aircraft into production. William Allen, Boeing's president, was betting the company on Tripp's vision. What they were building together was not merely an airplane, it was an argument about what air travel could be. We bring back the days when the journey meant just as much as the destination. The ships, the trains, the stories worth remembering. If you'd like to come along for the ride, subscribe. We've got more of these waiting for you. Now, let's continue. The Stratocruiser made its first flight on July 8, 1947, from Boeing's facility in Seattle. 3 test aircraft would fly 250,000 miles before a single passenger boarded. By the time Pan Am put it into service on the San Francisco to Honolulu route in 1949, this airplane had been tested as carefully as anything Boeing had ever built. Standing on the tarmac, it didn't look graceful. The Lockheed Constellation, its great rival, was a thing of beauty, its triple tail and curved fuselage suggesting a creature straining for flight. The Douglas DC-6 was clean and purposeful. The Stratocruiser was wide, blunt-nosed, a little ungainly, if you're being honest about it, like a man who carries himself with total confidence despite an unfashionable suit. What it lacked in elegance outside, it more than compensated for within. You stepped through the door, and the first thing you noticed was the space. The outer diameter of that upper cabin was 132 inches, wider than any competitor then flying. The DC-6 measured 125. 7 inches doesn't sound like much until you're in the air for 18 hours, and then it's everything. The early press coined a phrase for it. Not legroom, not comfort. They called it ambling space. Room to move. Room to be human. The interior was the work of Walter Darwin Teague, one of America's great industrial designers, a man who had designed Texaco filling stations, Kodak cameras, and the Steinway piano showroom in New York. His mandate from Pan Am was precise. Make passengers forget they are in a machine. Teague used muted colours and simple horizontal lines, not because he lacked imagination, but because those gentle lines echoed the horizon, visible through every window. Look inside, look outside, and the world didn't lurch or fight itself. You were always, gently, oriented toward the horizon. His team spent months on the seats alone. They pulled skeletal anatomy data from the Smithsonian Institution. They tested scores of volunteers, tall, short, wide, narrow. What they designed was described in Boeing's own materials, not as a seat, but as a chair. There is a difference, and at 35,000 feet, it is not a small one. Each chair had a built-in reading lamp, a call button for the steward, an ashtray, and a fold-out writing table. Everything you needed within arm's reach, nothing you didn't. For overnight crossings, and the Atlantic crossing from New York to London ran roughly 18 hours going west, the seats converted. Sets of 4 chairs folded into upper and lower berths, like a Pullman railway car, but roomier. The mattresses were proper mattresses, the linens were proper linens. There were privacy curtains. Pan Am stewards made up the berths the way a good hotel makes up a room. Turn-down service, a pillow placed just so. Toward the rear of the aircraft, the configuration became even more generous. A private compartment carrying 3 to 5 passengers, sometimes a family, sometimes newlyweds. Pan Am's documentation noting Hawaii as a popular honeymoon destination, with their own small dining table and the most private sleeping arrangement in commercial aviation. Staff called it, with a certain knowing warmth, the honeymoon suite. And then there were the dressing rooms. Separate facilities for men and women. Not the cramped necessity of a standard aircraft lavatory, but rooms where you could stand comfortably, arrange yourself, prepare for sleep or for landing as you chose. The men's dressing room could accommodate 6 passengers at once. 6 people, standing, comfortably, on an airplane. But the staircase. We keep coming back to the staircase. It was tucked amidships, a tight spiral of carpeted steps, descending through a hatch in the main cabin floor, and it led to the lower deck lounge. 14 seats, soft lighting, mirrors on the walls, a bar. The geometry of the fuselage curved gently overhead, lower than the main cabin, which gave the space an unexpected intimacy. Not a banquet hall, but a club room, the sort of place where people leaned toward each other when they spoke. Pan Am's version worked in consultation with Maxime's of Paris on the food and drink selections. Menus were printed in French with English subtitles. A rolling cart served cocktails and hors d'oeuvres on the main deck before dinner. The meal itself ran to 7 courses. Afterward, the lounge. Passengers called it the Stratocruiser lounge. Affectionately, always affectionately. Among its documented regulars, Mike Hawthorne, the British Formula One racing driver who crossed the Atlantic frequently in the mid-1950s and left no doubt about his preference. The fat old Stratocruiser is still my favourite aircraft for long distances, he said. Its spiral staircase and bar on the lower deck give passengers the opportunity to walk about and chat and get a change of scene, which passes the time more agreeably than sitting glued to one's seat for hours on end. He was not alone in that view. Ian Fleming, who was creating James Bond in exactly these years, partly on the basis of the glamorous international world he moved through, flew BOAC's Monarch Stratocruiser service regularly between London and Jamaica, where he kept his home. Queen Elizabeth II flew on the type as well, including a visit to Bermuda following her coronation in 1953. This was not a niche aircraft for a particular market. It was, for the people who could afford it, simply the way the world travelled. For 12 years. Let's imagine a crossing. New York to London, 1953. You've arrived at Idlewild Airport. It won't be called JFK for another decade. On a Tuesday evening in October. The terminal smells of cigarette smoke and something floral, women's perfume overlapping in the close air. Outside on the tarmac, lit by floodlights, the Stratocruiser sits low and wide. 4 propellers, each one wider than a man is tall, turn slowly as the engines warm. The sound carries even through the terminal glass. Not a whine, not a whistle, but a deep, rolling throb. Something that you feel as much as hear. You are dressed for dinner. Everyone is. The man ahead of you in the boarding line has a hat and a briefcase. The woman beside you wears gloves. This is what flying asks of you in 1953. It asks that you take it seriously. A steward meets you at the top of the air stairs. He has your name from the manifest. He knows already where you're seated. The main cabin opens before you, wider than you expected. The lighting is warm, amber. Teague's horizontal lines leading your eye gently down the length of the aircraft. Your chair, and it is a chair, you understand that the moment you sit in it, reclines to a comfortable angle, the cushion yielding in all the right places. You settle in and feel, without quite being able to explain it, that this is fine, that you are in good hands. The Wasp Major engines run up to full power, 3,500 horsepower each. All 4 together produce a sound that fills the aircraft without overwhelming it. Authoritative, purposeful, Idlewild falls away beneath you. The lights of New York scatter below, and then the darkness of the Atlantic opens ahead. Dinner is served at altitude. A rolling cart appears first. Cocktails, canapes, the quiet percussion of ice and crystal. Pan Am in 1953 is feeding more than 12,000 meals aloft every single day across its entire fleet. And the operation behind that number is extraordinary. A worldwide airborne catering system with commissaries on multiple continents, each producing food comparable to the best restaurants in New York or Paris. On your flight, the menu is printed in French. The wine has been chosen. The sequence of courses has been thought through by people who have thought about almost nothing else. 7 courses at 30,000 feet. Over the North Atlantic, United Airlines, on their Stratocruiser routes, employed continental-trained European chefs, men with more than 30 years of culinary experience each, who had fed people in the finest kitchens of the old world before coming to feed them in the new one, in the air. You eat. You talk to the person beside you, because at these speeds, on these routes, there is time to talk. The crossing runs 18 hours westbound. There is genuinely no hurry. After dinner, someone suggests the lounge. The staircase is tighter than it looks in the photographs. You have to mind your step. One hand on the rail, the carpet softening each footfall, and then you're there. 14 seats. The room curves gently overhead. The mirrors double the soft light, make the space feel larger than it is. Someone is already here. 2 people you don't know, deep in conversation about something you don't catch. You find a seat at the bar. The steward has a name for you already. He knows somehow that you take your whiskey with a single ice cube. The 4 engines hold their note somewhere below and behind you. The world outside the small oval windows is entirely dark. You are, at this moment, closer to the stars than to the sea. The thought occurs to you, as it occurs to everyone who makes this crossing, that you are in a remarkable place to be. You stay for 2 drinks, maybe 3. The conversation finds you, as it always does, in small rooms over large distances. You learn that the man at the end of the bar is a textile buyer from Manchester, making his 4th crossing this year. The woman across from you is a diplomat's wife, returning from a summer in New York. You will probably never see either of them again. But for this hour, 30,000 feet over the dark Atlantic, you are neighbours. At a certain point, 11, perhaps midnight, the stewards begin the transformation. On the main deck, the seats fold down, berths appear, linens are laid with care, the privacy curtains are drawn, the dressing rooms fill briefly, the ritual preparation for sleep that the designers had thought through, the standing room, the mirror at a proper height, the small dignities that make the difference between accommodation and comfort. You sleep in a proper bed, at altitude, over the ocean, at some point before London. The schedule says dawn, but dawn over the Atlantic runs long. A steward appears at your curtain with a gentle knock. Breakfast if you'd like it. In bed or when you're ready. Pan Am documented this as standard practice. Breakfast served to passengers in their berths before arrival. Tea or coffee, something warm. The world outside your window, if you pull the curtain, has gone from black to the deep grey blue of an Atlantic morning. Below, somewhere, Ireland. None of it happens without them. The crossing you've just imagined, the cocktails, the 7 courses, the berths turned down with perfect linens, the breakfast at dawn. None of it happens without the people who make it happen. And making it happen on a Stratocruiser required an army. A typical transatlantic crossing carried a flight crew of 4, a captain, a first officer, a navigator, and a flight engineer. The navigator on these pre-GPS, pre-inertial system crossings, worked with charts and celestial readings, calculating position by the stars when the ocean below offered nothing. The flight engineer watched 4 of the most complex piston engines ever put into a civilian aircraft, monitoring pressures and temperatures through a panel of instruments that took years to learn to read fluently. And then there were the cabin crew. In the early 1950s, competition between carriers on the North Atlantic was not primarily about price. Fares were regulated and essentially identical across airlines. The competition was entirely about service, about food, about the quality of the people who brought it to you. Air France had established an early and formidable reputation for airborne cuisine, and Pan Am and BOAC. And the American carriers watched this carefully and worked fiercely to match it. The women who staffed these cabins were selected with the rigor of a luxury hotel, trained not merely to respond to passengers, but to anticipate them. By the second morning of a crossing, a good stewardess knew her full manifest. She knew who took tea with lemon. She knew who would want the window shade raised before they asked. She knew the family in the honeymoon suite would need an extra blanket, and that the textile buyer in 14B had been up late in the lounge and would prefer not to be woken for the pre-arrival breakfast service. She knew because she had learned, and she had learned because she understood, in some practiced and professional way, that her job was not customer service in any ordinary sense. Her job was to make this machine feel like a home. Meanwhile, below the passengers, in the galley amidships on the main deck, another world was at work. The Stratocruiser's galley was a fully operational kitchen at 35,000 feet. Multiple ovens, 8 urns holding hot beverages, designated compartments for china, the full china, not the lightweight substitutes of later years, and for linens. The logistics of serving 7 courses to 60 or 70 people in the air, with equipment mounted on a vibrating aircraft in a space roughly the size of a large closet, required a kind of choreography that is hard to describe without having seen it. The galley crew worked through dinner service, through the lounge hours, and then through the night, preparing for the breakfast service before landing. They rarely saw the passengers, they rarely received the thanks, but the food they produced, reliably, consistently at altitude, in turbulence and in calm, was what gave these crossings their reputation. 4 million man-hours had gone into the engineering of the 377. That's the number Boeing put on the design work alone. 4 million hours to build an airplane. And then, for every crossing, a handful of people made it mean something. This is always true, of course. The ship is only as good as its crew. But on the Stratocruiser, the gap between what the machine offered and what passengers actually felt was bridged almost entirely by human beings who had decided to do the job properly. It seems worth saying. Here is the thing about the Stratocruiser that the airlines knew from almost the first year of operation, and that the passengers didn't know, and that no one talked about very loudly. The plane was losing money. Not occasionally, not on certain routes, consistently, almost structurally. The Stratocruiser was, in the blunt accounting language of the early 1950s, an airplane that was very nearly impossible to operate at a profit. In 1950, United Airlines ran 7 Stratocruisers on their routes. Each one averaged $2.46 in direct operating cost per plane mile. And that was only the direct cost, the fuel and the maintenance and the crew. Indirect costs were considered equal or greater. A 57-passenger Stratocruiser, United's accountants concluded, was unlikely to make money. 3 years later, in 1953, United's chief executive Ray Ireland said it plainly. He described the Stratocruiser as unbeatable in luxury attraction, but uneconomical. He acknowledged with a certain weary candor that Pan Am's competition on the Hawaii route had induced United to buy the plane in the first place, that they had purchased it essentially to keep up appearances, to be seen offering what Pan Am offered. It had cost them. The reason was the engines. The Pratt & Whitney R4360 Wasp Major was, in the mid-1940s, the most powerful piston radial engine ever built for a production aircraft. 4 rows of 7 cylinders stacked around a central shaft, giving it 28 cylinders in total, which is how it earned its nickname, the Corn Cob. The cylinder heads, arranged in rows, resembled kernels on an ear of corn. It produced 3,500 horsepower on takeoff with water injection. 4 of them together gave the Stratocruiser its power to climb to 35,000 feet, to push 340 miles per hour across an ocean, to carry 60-odd passengers and their luggage and their dinner service from one continent to another. They were magnificent engines. They were also, in a very particular way, too much. The R4360 burned 0.43 gallons of aviation gasoline per hour per horsepower. The competing Pratt & Whitney R2800, the engine powering the Douglas DC-6, the Stratocruiser's main rival, burned 0.38. 0.05 of a gallon doesn't sound catastrophic until you multiply it by 28,000 horsepower and 18 hours over the Atlantic, and then it becomes the difference between a route that works and a route that doesn't. But the fuel was only the beginning. The Wasp Major was an engine at the outer edge of what 1940s engineering could reliably sustain. It ran hot. It demanded maintenance that no other engine in commercial service demanded. And the propellers, massive 4-blade units turning enormous amounts of air into thrust, pushed the metallurgy of the time past reasonable limits. They started failing. Propeller pitch control systems malfunctioned, sending engines into overspeed. Propeller blades separated from their hubs in flight. The vibrations generated by failing propellers sent shock waves through airframes not designed to absorb them. The Civil Aeronautics Board issued airworthiness directives against the propeller systems in 1955, in 1957, and again in 1958. 3 times in 3 years, regulators told the airlines that the propellers on their most luxurious airplane were not working correctly. The accident record was, by any honest measure, alarming. Of the 56 Stratocruisers Boeing built, Pan American Airways, their most loyal and prominent operator, lost 7 in hull loss accidents. Nearly 1 per year from 1952 to 1959. United Northwest Orient, and BOAC, each lost one more. Pan Am, United, Northwest, and BOAC together operated fewer than 40 aircraft of this type. To lose 11 of them, roughly 1 in 4, was a number that hung over the airplane like weather. The passengers knew there were incidents, the newspapers reported them. But the full arithmetic, the fuel costs, the maintenance demands, the quiet financial hemorrhaging behind the champagne, and the 7-course dinners, that was a private conversation between airlines and accountants, conducted behind the scenes while the Stratocruiser lounge went on serving drinks. And then, on an October evening in 1956, the accounting became impossible to ignore. Pan Am's Stratocruiser, Sovereign of the Skies, departed Honolulu bound for San Francisco, carrying 24 passengers and 7 crew. Over the Pacific, 3.5 hours out with the Hawaiian Islands long below the horizon, the engineers began to lose engines. One, then another, a third began failing, and then the fourth started to go. Captain Richard Ogg had, in that moment, a simple and terrible decision. Attempt to reach land, or put the aircraft in the ocean while enough power remained to control the descent. He chose the ocean. He called for a Coast Guard vessel. He briefed his passengers. And then he flew his crippled aircraft down through the dark night and touched it onto the surface of the Pacific with enough skill and precision that the fuselage held, that the aircraft remained intact on the water long enough for every person aboard to get out. All 31 survived. The plane sank 20 minutes after ditching. Captain Ogg and his purser were the last to leave. It was, in the history of aviation emergencies, an extraordinary piece of airmanship. And it was also, in the history of the Stratocruiser, a moment of reckoning. This was what those engines could do at their worst. This was what the airplane demanded of the people who flew it. The airlines had known for years that the economics were wrong. What they hadn't yet had was a replacement. Then, in May 1950, Boeing engineer Wellwood Beale flew the final Stratocruiser delivery to BOAC in England. On his way home, he visited the Farnborough Air Show and saw something new. A slim, swept-wing aircraft with engines mounted under the wings in pods. Clean, purposeful, eerily quiet compared to the 4 thundering corncobs he'd been flying with. The de Havilland Comet, the first jet airliner. Beale returned to Seattle with a report. Boeing had already been studying jet propulsion. Within 2 years, they were building a prototype. Designated, somewhat deceptively, the Model 367-80, to make competitors think it was merely another variation of the old Stratofreighter. The aircraft that would become the Boeing 707 took shape in Renton, Washington. It flew for the first time in July 1954. Boeing's Civil Aviation Department had suffered a $15 million loss on the Stratocruiser program. They did not intend to repeat the experience. The date is October 26, 1958. Idlewild Airport, New York. Pan American World Airways has a new airplane. It's called the 707. The same airline, the same transatlantic routes. Juan Trippe, who had once ordered 20 Stratocruisers because he wanted to compete with ocean liners. Trippe had ordered 20 707s as well in October 1955 as the launch customer, before Boeing had a single other airline on the books. The man understood momentum. The 707 is different in almost every way that matters to an accountant. It carries more passengers than the Stratocruiser, up to 189 in high-density configuration, against the Stratocruiser's 84 or so in a typical setup. Its jet engines are faster and more fuel-efficient at altitude than any piston engine ever devised. Its first commercial transatlantic crossing takes 8 hours and 41 minutes, including a fuel stop in Gander, Newfoundland. The Stratocruiser, doing the same journey, took 18. There is no lounge, there is no staircase. There are 6 seats across, 3 and 3, and the aisle between them is narrow enough that a meal cart fills it entirely. The windows are a little smaller. The carpet is thinner. You cannot, on a 707, decide to go somewhere. You sit and you arrive. You sit and you arrive faster than seemed possible just a decade before. The airlines chose it without hesitation. United retired their Stratocruisers to BOAC in 1954, trading them away even before the jets arrived because they simply couldn't make the economics work. BOAC held on until 1959. Northwest Orient, the most operationally effective of all the Stratocruiser operators, the airline that had managed to make the economics function better than anyone else, flew their last Stratocruiser on September 15, 1960. They traded the remaining airframes to Lockheed in exchange for brand new Electra turboprops. No ceremony is recorded. Pan Am, which had loved this airplane more than anyone, which had built its Pacific and Atlantic reputation on it, which had lost 7 of them to accidents and gone on flying the survivors, retired its final Stratocruiser in 1961. 12 years. That's all there was. The surviving airframes were mostly scrapped. A few found second lives in cargo service. And then a small company called Aerospace Lines had an extraordinary idea. The Stratocruiser's double bubble fuselage, the designers noticed, was fundamentally a very large hollow tube. If you removed the structure connecting the upper and lower lobes and simply inflated the upper lobe, ballooned it outward, dramatically, absurdly, until it looked like nothing so much as a pregnant whale, you could fit inside it something that no other transport aircraft could carry. Large, odd-shaped objects. Spacecraft components, for instance. The result was called the Pregnant Guppy, and then the Super Guppy. The aircraft that had once carried passengers across the Atlantic in silk-sheeted berths, that had hosted queens and novelists and racing drivers in a mirrored cocktail lounge, ended its days carrying hardware for the Apollo program, the parts that would send human beings to the moon. There is something almost elegant about that. Something that suits an airplane that had always been at heart about the idea of going somewhere remarkable. We've been to the moon since then. We've crossed the Atlantic in 3 hours on Concorde, or we did for a while. We now do it in 7 or 8 on aircraft that carry 300 people and cost a fraction of what the old piston transports cost per seat mile, and that is all genuinely extraordinary, and the world is genuinely better for it. But there are things the Stratocruiser understood about a long journey that the airplanes which replaced it do not. A crossing of 18 hours is a significant portion of a human life. It asks something of you. It puts you in a sealed vessel above the ocean with a small community of strangers and removes for a time all the ordinary anchors of your days, your office, your family, your city, the routines that shape identity. You are suspended. The world is on pause. Where you are going has not yet begun, and where you came from has receded below the horizon. The Stratocruiser's designers understood this. They understood it so well that they built a room for it. A place to go below the floor, where the suspension could be acknowledged rather than endured, where the crossing could become its own small world, rather than merely the price you paid to get somewhere. Ken Dowd, a vice president at Walter Darwin Teague's firm, the same firm that designed the Stratocruiser's interior more than 70 years ago, gave an interview in 2013. He was talking about how they still try to achieve this. Today, we call it destination space, Chait, he said. But we have the same kinds of thoughts now as they did then, giving passengers a chance to get up for a moment. They had been trying for 7 decades to get back to what the Stratocruiser had. They haven't managed it. Not yet. The Boeing 747 came close. From 1970, its second deck carried a lounge, upstairs rather than down, which was a different thing emotionally, but a real thing nonetheless. Passengers gathered there. Conversations happened. The crossing had a place to be a crossing. Within a few years, the airlines converted the space to premium seating. Revenue trumped experience. The balance sheet made its argument and won, as it always seems to.